G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. I was asked by a long-time co-subscriber, name of Barklord, if I was going to have any kind of a rant about war in light of the doings of Uncle Spam, the pentagonal hemorrhoids and the excited status of Norte Armed Americano. I replied that I'd been thinking about it, and there were a couple of different ways of approaching the topic. One, before expressing any kind of a judgment on war, one should probably review what one knows about war, how one came to know it, when, where, why, and all that sort of thing. And I was born in 1961. Not a horrible long time after World War II. I'm not actually a baby boomer, because the baby boom was forecast in 1947 to be going to last for 10 years. It was going to be a decadal phenomenon, but definitely not a generation. I know when I went to school, we were told that we were not baby boomers because we were too young. Born in 1961, the baby boom started in 1946 and it finished in 1956. Although in actual point of fact, by 1948-49, the birth rate in America and Australia and Britain had peaked, and then the Korean War intervened, and by 1953 the birth rate was exactly the same as it was in 1939 before the Second World War. The idea that the baby boom lasted till 1965 is a puerile fantasy cooked up sometime after the 1990s, as I recall it. I suspect that people who were born between Sputnik 1 and Apollo 17, which is 15 years, which is how long a generation takes, were the space cadets. So, as a proper little space cadet, when I'd learned to talk and start asking questions, one of the first observations I made about the human herd was that a hell of a lot of questions related back to the war. You ask your parents what somebody was doing as a person, or why they were like the way they were, or why they were doing what they were doing, and the answer would commence with, oh well, back during the war he was, she was, blah 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 blah. So everything seemed to pivot around the war, and then I realised that there had been a First World War and there was a Second World War. But my mother's father had been in the First World War and he'd flown aeroplanes, and he was my hero as a kid. He died when I was 3. And my father's uncle had been flying aeroplanes in the same First World War, so yeah, I was raised to approve of that. My mother's brother and the husband of one of my mother's sisters, they'd both joined up for the Korean War. The other sister, she had a husband who was an American soldier from the Second World War. Awful lot of the people who were my parents' friends were returned servicemen and their wives. Australia was... We were pretty happy and proud of our role as being America's pet attack trained chihuahua. I used to watch the high school kids going to school on a Wednesday, and about half or more of the boys were wearing battle dress or jungle green, and they had berets on their heads, and they either had a 303 short magazine Lee Enfield over one shoulder, or they had an Owen gun. And back in the early 60s, our Prime Minister was terribly certain we were going to fight a war with Indonesia. And yeah, the school kids were issued with World War II surplus arms, and they were sort of marked at the start of their cadet parade on how shiny their gun was and how well they looked after it during the week, because they were being socialised into the role of soldiers. Say what you like about the Hitler Youth, they weren't sent home with a bloody M98 carbine. Australian Army cadets were sent home with the 303 Smelly. So as a little kid, I had the idea that you could indeed be a soldier in my hometown of Glen Innes. Which brings me to 1965, and in hindsight, that was when Australia had started committing to send troops to Vietnam, because, like I said, our Prime Minister was sure we were going to have a war with Indonesia, and he wanted to make absolutely certain that we were America's allies by dragging them into a war in Vietnam. We'd actually had Australian Army Corps of Advisors in Saigon since 1963, and I think we'd had observers there since 61. It was a long-standing plan of Robert Gordon Menzies to get America bogged in Southeast Asia, partly to give him a taste of fighting an imperial war on the losing side because of what he'd done to the British and French empires at the Suez Canal crisis. But anyway, I was in a car in Sydney in the traffic, and my auntie was driving, and my cousin was in the back seat with me, and Roddy was a year and a half older than me, and his father was one of my uncles who'd been in the Korean War. He'd been an infantryman operating a 303 short magazine Lee Enfield, and he'd been through a few human wave night attacks and stuff like that. So Roddy knew a fair bit about soldiers and army and war that I had no idea of. In the city they had televisions too. We didn't have a television. So anyway, Roddy asks me, what are you going to do when you grow up, Chris? And I said, I want to be a soldier. You know, Grandpa was a soldier, and Bert was a soldier, and your dad was a soldier, and real big on it. And Roddy sort of cocked one eyebrow and he said, well, if you're going to be a soldier, it means you've got to go to Vietnam. Where's that? Overseas, in Asia, you know, a hot and stinking, steamy jungle sort of a place. I said, why would I want to go there? And he said, well, if you want to be a soldier, that's what you've got to do. You've got to go to Vietnam. Why is that? And he said, because that's where the war is. If you want to be a soldier, you have to go where the war is. When I said I wanted to be a soldier in Glen Innes, he says, there's no war in Glen Innes, so you can't be a soldier there. I told him about the fellas in uniform with the guns, and he explained they were high school cadets, not soldiers. Next thing I knew about the war in Vietnam was my sister was thinking about getting engaged, and she and her boyfriend waited until after the conscription referendum to find out whether he was going to have to join the army and go to Vietnam, because if he had to go to Vietnam, they weren't going to get engaged, because he didn't know how he was going to come back, if he was going to come back, and what sort of mind he was going to be in when he come back. So yeah, they put off their engagement party until he made it through the conscription ballot. So at 5 years old, I knew that war involved going to Vietnam, and sometimes having to go to war whether you wanted to go to war or not, unless you wanted to be one of the protesters, because there was some talk of them too, although we didn't have a TV and I hadn't seen any of them. And then I can recall before we got decimal currency, so I would have been kindergarten, so we're talking 1966, I heard over the dinner table, Mum was a school teacher, she got sort of the school teacher's lunchroom gossip and recycled it over the dinner table. I learnt that one of the infant school teachers had been conscripted, and I was such an enthusiastic little true believer in the Anzac legend. I waltzed up to him in the playground and I said, "Sir." "Yes." "I hear you've been conscripted, sir." And his face fell and he looked at me and he said, "Yes." And I said, "Good luck, sir. I hope they don't shoot you." And he burst into tears and ran away, and we never heard of him again. And he was considered sort of weak and wussy for reacting like that, but I was cautioned very strongly not to talk to people about Vietnam like that again, because that's not how children speak to adults, not proper. And that would have been my first Anzac Day as a school kid, and because squadron leader who did very well in New Guinea come from Glen Innes, 76 Squadron used to put on a fly past over Glen Innes every Anzac Day, and as part of their practice they put a flight of de Havilland vampires. I think there were 3 of them, flew over the town going west to east on the Friday before Anzac Day, because Anzac Day was going to be on a Saturday or a Sunday. And yeah, war was a very gung-ho sort of a thing, and once a person learned to read, then it was into the Biggles books. And I was between Biggles and the Anzac legend, and at the holiday house at the coast, which Dad had bought from a returned serviceman, that was going to be his soldier settlers block. Was a quarter of an acre with a house on it and a rowboat with a net. He was supposed to be a commercial fisherman at Red Rock. There were 12 of them got marooned there. So Dad bought that house in 1948, and there was a copy of Khaki and Green and a copy of On Active Service. So he'd fought with the Australian Army in the Libyan desert, and he'd fought in New Guinea. And I wasn't allowed to take the books away from the holiday house in case the bloke ever showed up wanting them back. So they had to live at Red Rock at the holiday house, and it meant that as I learned to read, I got progressively more and more meaning out of these official propaganda, aid de memoir, go home and, look back on the glory of your military days type books. And yeah, one of Mum's sisters married an American who came out to Australia and died in the 60s from heart failure. And she made pretty much a religion of worshipping the American culture, so I got a fair whack at that, or got exposed to a fair whack at it. And every night on the TV we used to get to watch the news from the war, and we got 5 or 10 minutes of what the Australians had been doing in Vietnam, sandwiched around what the Americans and the Vietnamese had been doing in Vietnam. And there was this American general who used to get up there quite regularly and talk about the light at the end of the tunnel, if only he could get more soldiers to come and stand there looking at the light. And in February 68 there was the Tet Offensive, and on our TV we got to watch the American Marines storming the embassy, trying to get back into the American embassy because the Viet Cong were on the roof. And we got to watch the chief of the Saigon police, our gallant allies for whom we were sending so many young Australians to go over and dice with death on two-way rifle range. His idea of due process and law and order and charging somebody and prosecuting them and trying them and judging them and sentencing them was to pull his gun out of his pocket and shoot a bloke in the side of the head in the street because the fella had been arrested. Oh, I think across the road and around the corner from where a bomb had gone off at the chief of police best friend's house. And this was the culture for which our people were going overseas and fighting. We were behaving like America's pet attack train chihuahua, and I began to have ever more sympathy and fellow feelings with the anti-war protesters who were starting to make more and more noise in Australia. But I wanted to be a fighter pilot, so I was properly patriotic when it came to aeroplanes, particularly piston-engined aeroplanes with propellers. I wasn't much into jets. And then, well, the political climate that I grew up in was extreme capitalist right wing. I wasn't aware of it at the time, but my grandfather had been a local union representative for the wheelwrights and woodworkers, coach builders guild. But in 1919 he bought the business and he became a boss, and then he all of a sudden lost all patience with the unions. Having the banks closed for 3 years during the Great Depression might have had something to do with it, because he had to find wages for 12 employees when he had no access to his bank account. And I was solemnly told by my parents that if ever the Labor Party got into power in Australia, because we'd had the Liberal National Government for 28 years or 23 years previously, if the Labor Party got into government, because Labor was socialists, and socialists were actually communists under the skin, and the communists went in for secret police and concentration camps, then if the Labor Party got to power in Australia, then we were going to have secret police on the streets with submachine guns locking people up for what they thought and what they said. And Gough Whitlam was elected in November 1972 on a Saturday, and my parents went to bed absolutely shattered and crestfallen because their side had lost and they didn't think that God would allow such a thing. And I actually got up early on a Sunday morning and got on my push bike and went for a ride around the town because I wanted to have a look at these secret police with their submachine guns who were going to lock me up for thought crimes. No such fucking animal. And after that, Australia changed, like women and doctors were no longer locked up for terminating pregnancies. There was a single parent's pension, so if a kid grew up in a broken family, they didn't have to grow up in a parentless house because, their parent, the custodial parent, was no longer obliged to go out and make a living as well as work as a sole parent to keep the home and hearth together. No-fault divorce came in. We got universal health care. Western Sydney suburbs got indoor toilets and, flush plumbing. A whole lot of good things happened. And even before Gough got in, Australia pulled out of Vietnam in early or mid-1972, and then in 73 the Americans pulled out of there after all their talk about lights at the end of the tunnel and all the rest of it. And we watched on TV as Saigon fell and the Americans ran away from their gallant allies, and helicopters full of people landed on American aircraft carriers and disgorged hordes of refugees, and then they pushed the helicopter over the edge and into the ocean. And a whole bunch of Vietnamese refugees were welcomed with open arms into Australia because, like, you break it, you own it. We'd gone over there and told them all to have faith in right-wing, European-based capitalist philosophy, culture, ideology and economy, and our gallant allies in the ex-French colony had found themselves facing the prospect of jumping in a little boat and sailing to Australia, or getting locked up for having resisted their communist brethren. I don't know how long Vietnam went through a re-education phase, but they seem to be good little capitalists these days. Awful lot of retired American aero modelers rely on the idea of buying ready-to-fly aeroplanes that come in a box bigger than this hammock I'm sitting in, and all they've got to do is sort of bolt the pieces together and install the radios. Most of them have been made in factories in Vietnam. So, as I made my way through high school, I had mixed feelings on war. I had not really questioned the idea that the wars Australia had participated in had been noble, honest, honourable, just wars. I was used to the idea of the preacher from the church of Thou Shalt Not Kill getting up there on Anzac Day and preaching sermons about lest we forget the sacrifices that people had made in war so we could walk around and be free to have a swastika tattooed on our forehead if we wanted to, because freedom of speech, you know, like implied political freedom of speech, political freedom of expression. And the person was innocent until proven guilty, and police couldn't search you or enter your house without a warrant. You know, they taught us as primary school kids how the system was supposed to work. And until you've been arrested at gunpoint, you have a lot of faith in all of those teachings. But that's getting ahead of myself a bit. Because I was so terribly keen at a school where you couldn't join the Army Cadets until second form, or what they'd call these days Year 8, but you could join the band as a drummer in first form or Year 7. Guess who learned to play the drums on a kitchen table half an hour every Tuesday and Thursday before breakfast? And that meant that I could march around with a snare drum on my hip on Tuesdays when the cadets were meeting. And then that boarding school closed and I went back to Glen Innes High School and I joined the cadets again there. And actually went on a bivouac with them, marched in an Anzac Day service in my hometown as a cadet. And then I got shipped off to another boarding school, and at that place they'd closed their cadets because the Whitlam government closed down cadets while they were kicking off Medicare and the family court, doing all sorts of good things. They closed down cadets, and I was a bit dirty on them because I had a Beagles fetish. I really wanted to be a fighter pilot in the Air Force, and I knew that it helped with getting selected, and I knew it helped with promotion if you'd been in cadets. So I had very mixed feelings at the dismissal because I knew the dismissal meant getting rid of Whitlam in 75. And sure enough, I joined the cadets at the second boarding school when they started doing it again. But then I topped the course as a non-commissioned officer candidate, and we went on a bivouac there, and they gave me 3 blokes to command, and they told me I was in charge of a squad of urban guerrillas, and they gave me a topographic map and a compass with a square kilometre marked on it, and there was a really high hill in the middle of it, forested country. And 3 platoons were going to be looking for us. So we got half an hour head start, and I marched my little squad right to the top of the hill, and we waited up there, ready to ambush whoever come to the top of the hill. We figured we could see them wherever they were coming from. I guess I had read a book by a fellow called Che Guevara, and I'd been delving into World War I and World War II military memoirs, and I knew a little bit about small unit tactics and irregular operations and all the rest of it. I was keen. I was fucking keen, you know, as teenagers tend to be. So I thought I'd done really well. I'd tied down 3 platoons looking for me, and I'd suffered no casualties, and they'd wasted their whole bloody day. What else is the leader of a guerrilla band supposed to do? Well, apparently I was supposed to draw attention to myself and get massacred and captured and give everybody else in the 3 platoons a reason to feel good about himself. And that was the cherry on top as far as I was concerned, because the first time I'd been crestfallen by the traditions of the service was on bivouac with the Glen Innes High School cadets. The bloke who was my squad commander, in charge 12 of us, he was about 2 or 3 years further into puberty. He was bigger and heavier and covered with muscles, but he couldn't read a topographic map, and he wanted us to go to the top of a hill to play capture the flag. And if you can't read a topographic map and you're big and ugly and stupid, you'll march your squad of 12 younger teenagers up a bloody creek bed, knee deep, hopping over the bloody water-worn smooth boulders. It was horrible. Didn't like it at all. And that explained to me that if you join the military, you are entirely at the mercy of the person who's got one more stripe on their shirt sleeve than you've got, or one more pip on their shoulder tab. And in a shooting war, if you disobey a lawful command, they can execute you for, mutiny or cowardice or desertion. And I was sort of philosophically aware of that. But basically, when they refused to promote me after I'd succeeded as an urban guerrilla, commanding urban guerrillas, that's when I lost all interest in being in the military. Although about a year or so after that, I thought briefly about joining the army as an officer cadet so I could afford to learn to fly officially. But there again, I went in for an interview for an appointment, and while I was in the waiting room, I looked through the doorway into the next room and I saw about 15 young fellas standing to attention in front of a framed portrait under glass on the wall with their hand on their heart, and they were swearing allegiance to this picture of Queen Elizabeth II. And as I heard them say that they were agreeing to obey all lawful commands, I just had a momentary mental image of somebody with more stripes on their shirt shooting them for disobeying an order. And sometimes the person given the order is actually a half-wit, and the order might not be worth obeying, but the law says you've got to do what you're told to do. So I was less and less interested in a military career after flirting with the idea. And then, maybe a year later, I got a job as a student nurse. I didn't fit particularly well at the first hospital. After 3 months, they showed me the door because a helicopter joyride salesman does not fit the pigeonhole they had for a first-year student nurse. But I was stubborn, and I succeeded in getting a job at a bigger hospital in the city, and that was a repatriation general hospital run by the Department of Veterans Affairs. And 3 years later, on a night duty while I was bored in the wee small hours, I sat down and I averaged out how many shifts I'd worked and how many patients on the average shift. Da-di-da-di-da-di-da. By the time I'd finished 3 years as a student nurse at Concord Repat, I'd nursed 2,000 veterans of every military adventure Australia participated in from 1914 to 1984. And I'd nursed them for an average of 5 days each. And they'd been at just about every theatre of operations in every war from Gallipoli. In fact, before Gallipoli, there was one bloke who'd been on the amphibious expedition to Papua in 1914 when Australians went and burnt down a bunch of churches and got charged with rape and looting and arson when they come back to Australia. Very scurrilous sort of an episode, but it was how Australia opened the innings in World War One. I've nursed Australians who served with the International Brigade in Spain in the 1930s because they really hated fascists. And then they come back and joined the Australian Army and went and fought against the Nazis, the Italian fascists. Soldiers, sailors and airmen from all over Europe and the Pacific, and the Korean War and the Vietnam War. One fellow commanded mercenaries in Malaya, American mercenaries in Malaya in the 1950s. And I learned a lot talking to the veterans, and one thing that stuck out was that most of them couldn't point to the actual long-term good that had been achieved by the war that they participated in, let alone any good that had come from what they did in the war. You know, the war to end all fascism. Well, the fascists are all over the bloody planet. You know, they're on the ascendant at the moment. They've just about completely, thoroughly taken over the excited status of Norte armed Maracano. What they taught me, and you know, I had one patient in 1982. I nursed him for about 4 days, and he went to operating theatre to have a cleaning and debriding of a wound that went through his knee. He'd been riding a motorcycle in Malaya in 1942 when a Japanese aeroplane's rear gunner had shot him off the motorbike. His knee was bent and the bullet went straight through the bent knee, and he finished up in a ditch in the mud, and the mud got into the hole in his knee. And he come back on a series of boats, got back to Western Australia and spent about a year and a half in the Repat hospital, and then they gave him a medical discharge because he wouldn't let them cut the leg off. And I think he'd had 27 different attempts surgically to clean this thing out, and basically he'd been doing wound dressings on the entrance and the exit wound the whole time. For 40 years, from 1942 to 1982. And after the 28th attempt to clean this bloody wound out and pump enough of the new antibiotics in there that they might kill the bugs and it might perhaps heal up, the septic shock from the bacterial infection and the final anaesthetic, yeah, that took him out. But I have had one patient actually die of bullet wounds 40 years after he got shot. And what they taught me is that all war is always all bullshit. They don't join up to enlist to save the world from for democracy or from democracy. They enlist because they think it's the right thing to do. It often presents an opportunity to travel the world, see interesting people, and only have to shoot at half of them. A lot of them are pressured with the idea that if they don't join the military, they're going to be thought as too scared to join the military, and not many young fellas want to be thought of as a coward. And there used to be people who run around society giving out white feathers to anybody who they thought looked as if they should be in the military. And in Australia, we were fairly proud that we only fielded volunteers overseas. We did have some conscripts and militia fight in New Guinea, but that was an Australian territory. They were defending Australia by the definition of the day. But everybody we sent to the Middle East, everybody we sent to Europe, all of them, every one of them was a volunteer. Volunteers to Korea, volunteers and conscripts to Vietnam. Half of the Australians who died in Vietnam were conscripts. But there is a theory that conscripts don't fight quite as hard as all volunteer forces, because all volunteer forces have self-selected for the people who've got copies of the suite of genes you need in order to be able to rationalise the killing of members of your own species and to withstand an attack by members of your own species. And apparently 5% of humans have got 2 copies of that gene suite, or galaxy of genes, and 10% have got 1 copy from each parent, sort of thing. And that hypothesis, which I traced to a fellow called Grossman, David Grossman, a colonel, Green Beret, several tours of Vietnam, got right into human physiological response to being in combat and being afraid of imminent death while attempting to kill somebody else. He even got to the point where Massachusetts Institute of Technology was paying him to put biomedical sensors on policemen on patrol in Chicago, because that was a war zone, and that way he could get telemetered data on their heart rate and their respiration rate when they suddenly came under gunfire unexpectedly. And his work built on a thing called the Miller Report, which came out in the 1940s and indicated that the fellow who surveyed US Marine Corps infantrymen who fought in the Second World War in the Pacific Theatre, and he found that only 13% of them fired their weapon their first time in combat. Repeated exposure brought the firing rate, shooter rate, up to about 30%. And then after the conflict, 15% of the participants went doolally-plop crackers because they couldn't handle the memories of what they knew they had done. They didn't have the neurocircuitry to shoot members of their own species. But the army didn't process it that far. What they figured out was that they had to use operant conditioning so that people would be triggered to go into a conditioned response. So when you shot at them, they would immediately lay down and shoot back at whatever was in front of them with their feet towards their friends. So they'd basically form a circle of people lying on the ground, all shooting at the tree line. And that would suppress whatever was shooting at them long enough for them to figure out what it was that was shooting at them, and then they could concentrate on the actual threat. But it was considered important to get a response off quickly. Entirely different to what they called reconnaissance by fire. And reconnaissance by fire is when they're sort of wonkering around and they don't know where anybody might be hiding, so they just shoot at the tree line, and if it bleeds, there was somebody hiding there. So, the people who went to Vietnam after the operant conditioning, they got their first time shooter rate up to 30%. Maybe, yeah. I think that was it. And then that more or less doubled. They got up to 60% of people were firing their gun after repeated exposure to combat. And then when they came home, 45% of the people who'd been in combat finished up in the Vietnam Veteran Syndrome ward at the psych hospital because they didn't have the neurocircuitry to be able to cope with what they remembered having done. So, particularly with conscripts, you've only got 15% of the people in your conscript army who've actually got the genes to be there, whereas if you've got a volunteer army, you wind up with 30% who've got the genes to cope with killing other people. But even so, even if you've got the genes to do it, it doesn't mean that the stress isn't going to drive you crackers just from sheer nervous strain and fatigue. Grossman said that 98% of people, participants, who'd been in combat for 60 continuous days had become psychiatric casualties. They'd just been there too long. Even if they had the genes for the neurocircuitry to be able to justify to themselves what they were doing, why they were doing it, to who they were doing it to, the strain of waiting for the next breath to bring a mortar plop coming in through the roof of the tent was just too much for them. He said the people who did not become psychiatric casualties from being in combat for 60 continuous days, those 2% were sociopaths before they got into combat. And Grossman said they thrive in an environment where they are permitted to kill people. They get patted on the head for it. And he said they win a lot of medals, but they have a very high casualty rate. And when you think about it, it might not be a particularly clever idea to look at somebody who's distinguished themselves by being utterly ruthless on the battlefield, because they cannot imagine themselves actually being severely hurt. They can imagine themselves hurting other people, but nothing's going to hurt them. They're fucking invulnerable. And then give them a bunch of medals and promote them in civilian life and let them make decisions about society. They're not the sort of people who are going to be any good at caring for anyone unless it's a technical exercise of caring for their troops in the field, and they'll only care for them in ways that make their troops more combat effective so that they can be more useful to them. So then the people who'd been to Vietnam and Korea and World War II, they began to display a higher suicide death rate than the background population. And that was an anecdotal thing for a long time. But then at the end of the last century, the Australian Institute for Health and Welfare Statistics published a couple of papers. The first one in 1998 was mortality and morbidity in Vietnam veterans and their offspring. And what they found was that people who'd been in combat in Vietnam initially, but I'll jump ahead of myself a little bit to say that the later report in the year 2000 broadened the scope to look at veterans from any war encounter that Australians have been to, all the way back to World War I. Because when the first report came out, all of the veterans and their wives and widows deluged the Institute with extra evidence, so they had to rewrite the report basically. The actual combat veterans had twice the suicide death rate of the background population. And the funny thing, hilarious actually, is that the combat veterans have the same increased death rate as the military veterans who'd never been in combat. So it's not actually getting shot at, it's something to do with being in the military that doubles their suicide death rate. One hypothesis is that it's something that happens to them in basic training when they're being deliberately depersonalised through being brutalised, so they can then be repersonalised with all of their loyalty hinged on their unit, their intake of trainees going through basic or wherever they get posted to, the air crew on that aeroplane or the crew on the ship or the platoon of infantry or the gun crew at an artillery regiment. They get depersonalised, brutalised and repersonalised and reprogrammed. It's what basic training is for. Maybe something in that process causes them to double their suicide death rate. Or people who have already got an increased likelihood of dying from suicide may be particularly attracted to joining the military. Now, there are two particular categories of people who I know to be living at a markedly increased risk of dying from suicide. One is same-sex attracted teenagers growing up in Australia before the Equal Marriage Act, Gay Marriage Act. They, before the new law came in, making it lawful for same-sex attracted people to get married officially, they used to have 6 times the background death rate between the ages of 15 and 25. Something about being same-sex attracted in New South Wales inland country towns sent teenagers to their death. Probably on a related level, it seems any incident during which an individual is afraid that they're going to die suddenly and violently can fry their amygdala and their hippocampus, so the part of their brain that deals with emotional stress gets damaged, and the part of the brain that translates short-term memory to long-term memory gets fried, and they can wind up with terribly frightening memories that live in an island of memory somewhere in their hippocampus. And then when their amygdala, which has also been fried, notices a few similarities between the current situation and the situation just before the violent, terrible, frightening event happened, they can go into flashbacks. and being sexually assaulted or getting raped is one of these situations, just like a car accident sort of thing, or being in a public mass shooter situation. Eating your sandwich and suddenly people are dying from gunshots all around you. That'll fry bits of your head. So it turns out in 2010, on Valentine's Day, from 5 o'clock in the morning until 1 o'clock in the afternoon, every ABC Radio national news bulletin led off with a 2-minute item explaining how the Melbourne University School of Medicine had published in the Australian Medical Association's journal, which is a recognised scientific journal, peer-reviewed, the results of their long baseline life outcomes survey into survivors of childhood sexual assault. And they said they'd got 2,000 cases and they started picking them up in 1965. And they stopped collecting in 1985 and they observed them until 2005 and they crunched the numbers for 5 years and ruled a line under it, and the findings were survivors of childhood sexual assault grow up, if they do, but they grow up to display 18 times the background death rate from suicide, 1,800%, and 48 times the background death rate from accidental drug overdose, 4,800%. And their deaths from both causes cluster 18 years after the abusive event. So I'm going to suggest that perhaps people who have survived childhood sexual assault already have a much higher incidence of death by suicide, and they are perhaps attracted to join the military because they want to set the world to rights by killing all the bad guys. They want to be told where to go, when to go there, what to do when they get there. They want to be given goodie points for standing in neat straight rows with their shoes shined and their hands by the seams of their trousers. What the hell do you think you got seams in your trousers for if not to show you where to put your hands when you're on parade, son? They quite like a bit of discipline. So maybe that's why people who join the military have a higher suicide rate. However, it turns out that the children of combat veterans display 3 times the background suicide death rate. They're half as bad off as the same-sex attracted kids growing up in homophobic inland New South Wales. And the children of combat veterans also display 1.8 times the death by accident rate and 1.2 times the death by illness rate, because they're constantly trying to live up to their perception of the expectations of their war hero parent. And they've got to be tough. They don't get taken to the doctor when they fall off the motorbike, because a sucking chest wound is nature's way of telling you to slow down, son, telling you to slow down. So the bottom line is that far from doing your kids a favour by joining the military, you are increasing their death rate by 400%, 300% from suicide, 180% from accident, 120% from illness. That is the effect. It's like applying for a partial Darwin Award whenever anybody enlists in any armed farce. And I say armed farce because since the end of the American Civil War, no war has ever been entered into by any nation that's gone into the war willingly and come out of it with their stated war aims achieved. It just doesn't happen. Did Kaiser Wilhelm stabilise Europe for his national monarchy and his empire in World War I? Not noticeably, no. Did Adolf Little Whiskers achieve a 1,000-year Reich? Not noticeably. He was in charge for 12 years. And while he was in charge, the German nasty party was absolutely horrible and terrible and wicked and evil to a whole bunch of people, including Europe's Jews. Killed about 6 million of them. Killed millions of other people as well. But at the end of World War II, Europe as a whole basically said to the surviving Jewish people who'd got through 12 years of Hitlerism, they said to them, oh, you won't want to live next to us anymore, will you? You won't want to come home to Europe. You'll be too frightened that we might just at the drop of a hat suddenly turn around and stick you back in Dachau like Adolf did, or Bergen-Belsen, or Auschwitz. Why don't we subsidise you going somewhere else and having a country all of your own, just for the Zionists? What about, well, Madagascar was Hitler's idea. There was a bunch of people who wanted to have a Jewish colony on northwest Tasmania. But haven't the Zionists been saying a prayer every Passover next year in Jerusalem? Why doesn't the British League of Nations mandated Palestine Authority organise for all of the Jews who survived in Europe to repatriate to Palestine? Why don't we do that, said the Europeans. And yeah, the European Jews got the message, and they willingly went along with Europe's last colonial gasp. The Palestinians weren't real impressed. Having fought for the British Empire during the First World War under the Sykes-Picot Act. And the Zionists who were living in Palestine in 1947 were a fairly unprepossessing bunch, you know. I mean, we've got to duck back a little bit. In 1941, if somebody threw explosives in a picture theatre to make a political statement, they were called an anarchist, bomb-throwing anarchist. In 1942, a fellow called Arthur Harris realised that the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command couldn't hit anything smaller than a city, so he decided to have a go at incendiary bombing of Germany's wooden cities. And after they'd firebombed Rostock and Lübeck, a fellow called Joseph Goebbels, Doctor of Philosophy, Propaganda and Education Minister, he stood up, made a big speech, and because the RAF Bomber Command aircrews were sitting up on top of the gravity well, dropping their bombs where they were very difficult to catch up with, he described them as terrorfliegerinnen, terrorist flyers. And the German government latched onto this word terrorist, somebody who's sowing terror among the population. And then they started applying it to people who were fighting with partisan forces, the French Marquis, the resistance. In all the occupied countries, partisans were described as terrorists, and because they were terrorists, they were just shot out of hand. They weren't treated as Geneva Convention prisoners of war. Even after D-Day, when the Allied armies were moving through France and the local resistance fighters using Allied supplied arms and ammunition and sometimes uniforms as well, because they were local yokels with a gun, they were termed terrorists, and it went on the death certificates of every German who got shot fighting with the locals in Paris and killed by terrorists. So by the end of World War II, a terrorist was anybody who makes a military attack against the designated authorities or the society or the government, against whose attack the authorities have no effective defence. If you can't beat somebody who's attacking you, you just call them a terrorist. So in 1947, Yitzhak Rabin and Ariel Sharon were arrested by the British Palestinian mandated authority because they were wearing lipstick and wigs and high heels and dresses in public places in Tel Aviv, where they were throwing hand grenades stolen from the British Army into Arab coffee shops because the Zionists wanted to clear the Arabs out of what they wanted for their homeland. And the British mandated Palestinian Authority caught these bastards and locked them up, and they charged them with being Zionist terrorists. After the Royal Air Force Bomber Command and the partisans in Europe fighting the Nazis, the first people to be branded as terrorists anywhere in the world after World War II were two blokes who later became prime ministers of the terrorist state of Israel. And I say it's a terrorist state because it was founded by terrorists using terrorist methods. stolen submachine guns, Sten guns, and stolen hand grenades in coffee shops. And then, of course, it was the Mau Mau, who were called terrorists by the British Empire in Kenya. And then the French, they called the Algerians terrorists. And the French called the Vietnamese and the Laotians and the Cambodians, called all of them terrorists. And in every one of those cases, the terrorists won. So terrorist is a loser's word for someone you can't beat or defend yourself against. So if you look at it that way, everything those veterans told me about war turned out to be correct. It's always all bullshit. And the only reason they stuck with it was because they did not want to let down their mates, their companions, the people that they were serving alongside. When somebody else started shooting at them, they did not want to turn tail and run away and leave anybody else to get hit by the bullet that would have been aimed at them. Fear of being perceived to be a coward was greater than the fear of the enemy. So that's kind of what I've learned about war. I started off as a true believer, and by the time I finished picking up the pieces of 70 years worth of Australia's warfare and warrioristic expeditions, I was more or less of a pacifist, but I was also a rifle team captain by heart, or at heart. And I'd grown up with guns, and it wasn't until I lived in the forest at the other side of Emmaville and shot all the meat I ate for 2 years because I was trying to prove a vegetarian wrong. And I gave up on killing things for the taste and the grease. 2 weeks after that, I run into a book of God theories which suggests that one should be a pacifist and a vegetarian. So I sold all of my guns. And it's an interesting book of God theories. Not only has it got a publisher's synopsis, it's also got an index and a glossary of weird words and all the rest of it. So, for the first time, I encountered a God theory which had some concerted, coherent thoughts about warfare, and in the eyes of the universal creator God theory, what the God theory has to say about war. Because I'll be honest with you, the established big religions are very contradictory, you know. Thou shalt not kill versus an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. How do you reconcile that? Perhaps an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth was a very, very old admonition which had the effect of causing anybody to only punish anybody who had hurt them. One eye for one eye, one tooth for one tooth. And if somebody punches you and takes out your eye, you don't get to go and blind his whole family. So maybe a long time ago that was a message of restraint. But it's got me baffled how a bunch of people who say they are bound by the Mosaic tenets, so that takes in all of the Jewish people, it takes in all of the Christians, it takes in all of the Muslims, and there's a Mosaic commandment that says thou shalt not kill. And there are people who argue that it says thou shalt not murder, but murder is a legal charge in a court, which means intentionally kill. So thou shalt not murder means thou shalt not intentionally kill. Now, I defy anybody to say that you're not intentionally killing somebody when you put on a bloody army suit, pick up an army gun, pick up an army bullet, load the army gun with the army bullet, take aim at somebody else for wearing a different shirt and squeeze off on them. You're not intentionally patting them on the head or smacking their bum with a poppy petal. You're intentionally trying to kill them. That's why you're using a death machine. So I don't understand how anybody can claim that they're a Christian of the thou shalt not kill God theory who wants to go to war with anyone for any reason about anything. You're supposed to turn the other cheek and offer up the second cheek to be hit if anybody smacks you on the first cheek. Someone smacks you on the left-hand side of your face, turn your head and let them smack you on the right-hand side of your face. And if you actually try that after they've hit you twice, they're sick of it. They've got it out of their system. They feel like an arsehole, and you can discuss your differences. In my experience, that's what happened to me when I tried it. So, getting back to this Book of God theory and warfare, there is in the Book of God theory a book of judgment. And in the book of judgment, there is a fairly long entry which purports to be God's judgment against war. Behold, change of venue. Granny glasses fitted. Behold, it is indeed a book of God theory, vintage 1882, as promised. There is a glossary. Look at that. The entry, Christ, or Christ. Wisdom, knowledge, education. Full stop. After the false god Louis Amung falsely took this name, it became synonymous with warrior. Christians, or Christians. A brotherhood of warriors. They were named Christians in derision by the Hebrews. One who rushes into a multitude of rioters and with a sword enforces peace is a true Christian. Christy known? Pete Hegsworth, perhaps? John Bovino. John Mukow. Bovine means Mukow. A people whose faith is in arms and standing armies. We got the biggest army in the world. The following words are synonymous: Brahma, Buddha, Christ, Christ, Baal, Ashtaroth, Dagon, Vishnu, Ashdod, knowledge, wisdom, Krishna, light, Po, Te, In, Wa, Manitou, and in fact, a score of others. And the glossary goes on. And then there's a publisher's synopsis. And the Book of Judgment starts on page 773. Page 803, Against War. Actually, 803 is God judgeth the missionaries. 804, God judgeth dominions. God judgeth the man of promise. God judgeth war. Starts on 805. I think we'll start at paragraph 12. Judgment is rendered against all nations and peoples in the world who engage in war, thus bringing these afflictions upon the angels of heaven. Die in a war, the dead soul goes into the afterlife. Somebody else has got to deal with the chaotic spirit of a person who's been killed in warfare. 13. Judgment is rendered against every nation and all people in the world who carry on war, or who are accessory to war, wherein any, it says man, but we'll call person, any person created alive by Jehovah is slain in defence of any king or other ruler, or in defence of any country or government in all the world. Now, I'm not real happy with using that Jehovah word for the universal creator God theory, because it's book's 140 years old. People had different ideas about the universal creator God theory. I'm going to stick with the idea of the creator in the rest of this reading. It sticks in my craw a bit less. So that, we'll start again. Judgment is rendered against any nation and all people in the world who carry on war or who are accessory to war, whereby any man created alive by the universal creator God theory is slain in defence of any king or other ruler, or in defence of any country or government in all the world. And whether the war be offensive or defensive, my judgment is against its aiders and abettors, and against the kings and queens or other rulers who are parties to war, willingly, knowingly, or otherwise. And I judge him guilty also who is general, commodore, captain, sergeant, or private, that engageth in war or taketh part therein, aiding, abetting, or otherwise, whereby any human created alive by the universal creator God theory is slain or caused to suffer death. And yet, I'm going to black out or fail to read paragraph 16, 17, 18 and 19 because it basically hypothesises as to what happens to the spirit souls of people who have died in the afterlife, and we're all going to find out what happens in the afterlife one day soon enough. Let's not speculate in the here and now. However, paragraph 20, judgment is rendered against all nations and people who use prisons as places for whipping and torturing prisoners, and against all nations and peoples who put to death by hanging, shooting, or in any way whatsoever any prisoner or any person whom the universal creator God theory has created alive. Judgment is rendered against the judge and the jury who condemn to death any man, any human, and against the lawmakers who make or have left in force a law authorising death as a penalty against any person that the universal creator God theory has created alive, and against any sheriff or executioner that putteth to death willingly or knowingly any person created alive. And this is the bondage I put upon all, such as obey not my judgments and conform thereto. They shall not rise above the first resurrection in heaven, whilst war remaineth upon the earth. Even though their bondage be 100 years or 1,000 years, yet this my judgment against them shall not be put aside. Well, all of those people who joined the Australian Defence Forces, who I nursed, part of their enlistment contract was the idea that they would get Department of Veterans Affairs supplied, funded, free healthcare for the rest of their life if they come home alive. So I'm actually part of the mechanism that causes people to join up, or I have been. I spent 3 years getting paid to pick up the pieces of war. So yeah, that clause scoops me up rather neatly. I'm not saying I'm holier than thou, I'm saying I'm just as fucking bad as the rest of you. In the eyes of my idea of the universal creator God theory, I'm cop the same penalty as somebody who run around pulling the trigger. Neither shall any king nor queen nor any other ruler in all the world impress, that's conscript, as a soldier, any person who is unwilling to engage in war. And whosoever obeyeth not this my judgment shall not rise above the first resurrection in heaven, whilst war remaineth on the earth. Neither will I more consider the prayers of any king or queen or any other ruler or any nation or people in all the world who engage in war, offensive or defensive, or who aid or abet war in any way whatsoever. But I will abandon all such people, and my lords shall abandon them, and my holy angels shall abandon them, and they shall be left as a prey to their own harvest of evil spirits and to all manner of Jujars. And they shall be afflicted with assassinations, and intriguers, and despoilers, and with anarchy, and with riots, and destruction. For they shall be made to understand that whomsoever was created alive is sacred upon the earth, and that whosoever heedeth not these my judgments sinneth against the almighty universal creator God theory. Behold, it is not sufficient apology for them to say, "Oh, an evil king will come upon my country and possess it." I say unto thee, O man, all countries are the universal creator God theories. Be thou his servant unto peace and righteousness, having faith in him. Behold, thy God hath come to put away old things and give unto you the kingdoms of the universal creator God theory as they are in his exalted heavens. Heed thou the judgments of thy God theory. Thou canst not stay the hand of the Almighty. And it goes on. There's over 900 pages of it. There's a commentary. And there's an index which starts on page 922 and runs on to page 990. So a lot of food for thought, and happily that says you should not run your life by reading the book every day. Dig into it, see what it's got to offer, take any lessons that you feel like taking up out of it, but then go and live your life according to your own personal conscience. That's pretty much what it said in there to me. I've got a copy. I don't read it on a regular basis. But the thing is, anything I've looked up, I've come up with an answer that I can't actually argue with. It's a bit like the idea that I was keen enough and green enough to join 3 different cadet brigades because I was hoping to do better when I joined the military. I didn't join the military, but I was happy to go and get paid for curing the sick, comforting the dying and trying to raise the dead when it comes to people who'd been away to war and they were coming back for their Veterans Affairs free healthcare. So yeah, I have aided and abetted warfare on the earth and made it possible for it to occur, because if they didn't know they were going to get free healthcare from Veterans Affairs, some of them would not have signed up. It was part of the contract. So it's unpalatable. It means that, yeah, I can't pretend to be holier than thou. But, you know, once upon a time I used to shoot kangaroos and eat them. These days kangaroos come and knock on my door and ask if they can share my breakfast. It's not as if a person is held to whatever standard they have demonstrated when they've been doing something bad when they didn't know any better. The idea is when you know you've been doing the wrong thing, you're supposed to change. And as I said, I grew up being taught that America was a nation where at least most of the people were trying to be fair and honest and decent and reasonable, and they acted under the guidance of science. But then Ronald Reagan came into power and he abolished the fairness doctrine. And the fairness doctrine used to make it against the law for any American news or editorial material broadcast across state lines to be a lie. The fairness doctrine said that all news and editorial material broadcast across state lines had to be able to be proved true according to the best scientific knowledge known at the time. And a bloke called Rupert Murdoch wanted to leave Australia and invest in American media because there were more people, he could make more money. He got lawyers to lobby Reagan, suggesting that the fairness doctrine was an unconstitutional constraint against Fox Entertainment Proprietary Limited's constitutional right as a corporate citizen to freedom of speech. If they were forced to only tell the truth, it would be really expensive. They'd have to hire reporters and they'd have to go out and discover what the news was and edit it and present it in such a way that they told the truth. Murdoch's business model involved having 2 or 3 talking heads locked up in a room with a cameraman, a lighting director and a sound recordist, and they would talk outrageous, exciting bullshit at each other, and the engagement with the audience was much higher with the exciting, outrageous bullshit, so that people actually stayed listening during the ad breaks because they wanted to see what the next exciting, outrageous bullshit statement was going to be, or what the answer to it was. So Murdoch was able to put more ads in his exciting, outrageous bullshit, and he was able to charge more money for the ads, and it became a race to the bottom for everybody else in the industry. And Richard Nixon's Watergate was the first vibrantly obvious warning flag that America was sort of in the grip of a bunch of rogues, and sometimes the rogues were in power and sometimes the good blokes were in power, and it's got worse and worse and worse until the rogues have completely white-anted every check and balance and democratic system of restraint that's supposed to ensure good government for the population. The current war, epic foolishness, Epstein foolishness, it appears more or less to be a war designed to please Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu and Trump are both attempting not to go to jail by retaining power by whatever means is necessary in their estimation. There's a strange phenomenon whereby any conquered people, when they finally get out from under the yoke of conquest, they promptly adopt all of the very worst features of the people who had conquered them. So in any nation that's a post-colonial, ex-British imperial possession, if you walk into a public building, get inside, turn around, look over the doorway, and it says in Latin, "He leaves." And it says "he leaves" in Latin because the entire British Empire was still attempting to prove that they were as good as the fucking Roman Empire who had conquered their ancestors. Well, the Jews of Europe were conquered by the Nazis, and the Nazis had concentration camps. So the Zionists in Israel have had a concentration camp called Gaza, where they kept all of the Palestinians for 47 years or something. And whereas when the concentration camp inmates in the Warsaw Ghetto were considered to be heroic because they mounted suicide attacks against the SS concentration camp guards during the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, and the Allies did nothing while the SS ground them into fucking compost underfoot because the Europeans weren't actually keen on having the Jews survive. The Zionist state of Israel is behaving exactly like Zio-Nazis. Hitler wanted his Lebensraum because the Aryan gods promised it to the Jews, that Germany should have that land. I'm seeing Israeli politicians claim that only the Jews were promised the land in the Middle East, as Israel orders America to join Israel in attacking Iran while Israel invades Lebanon. The Americans are discovering that having a few patriots in a small battery in every one of their allied countries in the Mediterranean isn't such a rinky-dink strategy when their enemy, designated, embraced, war by choice enemy, has lots and lots and lots of attack drones and some ICBMs, and they're attacking every neighbouring country which has an American base, and the Americans are finding that they're running out of interceptors. And the Iranians, they're apparently suggesting that this last week they've been firing all their oldest and least capable munitions to soak up as many of the American interceptors as possible. And the Americans fired a lot of interceptors in 2025 when they backed up Israel's attack on Iran, and they were guarding anywhere that the Iranians were shooting back at. It'll be very interesting to see how deep America's arsenal of weapons actually is. And I would suggest that the government in Beijing must be just partying every successive day that America hands out interceptors all over the Middle East to safeguard the American allies in the Middle East from the attacks launched by Iran. We're probably well past the point now where America does not have the wherewithal to dispute China repossessing Formosa. Anybody who lives on what they like to think of as Taiwan and thinks they've got a future living there in Taiwan, I think they might be dreaming. And meanwhile, Thwaites Glacier in Antarctica is ready to go. The Greenland ice cap is ready to go. Between them, they promise 6 metres each, so 12 metres of sea level rise. And the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation current appears to be slowing down and slowing down and slowing down. So the hot water in the Gulf of Mexico is no longer moving up past the east coast of America and keeping the east coast of America warm and functional during winter. And it's no longer going to Europe. Pretty soon the European seaports are all going to be ice locked in winter because no AMOC, no Gulf Stream, no warm water, which is deliciously counterintuitive that global warming would freeze Europe where they had their industrial revolution and started burning coal on an industrial factory-based scale. Impacts around the world, well, part of the fun of having an electric motorbike means I only put fuel in my motor car about once a month. Yesterday, on the 5th of March, I put fuel in my motor car. Previous time I put fuel in my motor car was the 2nd of February. Instead of $1.86 a litre, it was $2.24 a litre. The price of fuel has gone up by 40%. 40%. And apparently all that happened in the last week. Anybody who was complaining about a cost of living crisis and affordability before Mr. Trump decided that he was going to do what Mr. Netanyahu said and make war on Iran for reasons that nobody has yet made clear, they're going to find that they're not able to burn as much fossil fuel in the same amount of time. Economic activity and agricultural activity is going to go into a decline, and that'll push prices up further. So yeah, there you go. Barklord. This is the second time I've tried to make this video, and it's probably run longer than the first time. First time it was 1 hour and 28 minutes. And when I got to the very end of it, I realised that I had called you Barklord, I'd called you Barkhorn in the first 5 minutes of the video. And there was another mistake somewhere else in there, so therefore I had to delete the 1 hour and 28 minute video and wait a day or so and then do this again. And I don't know how many mistakes are in this one. I don't think there are too many. I don't know what I've left out of it. But yeah, I've told you how I went from being a true believing Biggles fetish with a deep strain of the Anzac legend all the way through to realising after talking to the veterans that all war is always all bullshit. The only bloke who I met who was a Vietnam veteran who thought the Vietnam War was a good idea had come home at age 19 and he was missing 2 legs and 1 arm and he had some holes in his belly. He'd been carrying his SLR, self-loading rifle. He was point man of his whole platoon and they walked into a horseshoe ambush. So he had enemy on 3 sides of him, and when they fired at him, one of their bullets hit the magazine on his self-loading rifle and set off his ammunition. And in the various bits of shrapnel, yeah, he lost 2 legs and an arm. And he'd lost so much by his participation in the Vietnam War that in 1982, you know, like 30 years later, we'd really only be 10 years later at that point. Yeah, 10 years down the track, he wasn't ready to even consider the idea that the war he fought in, or what did it say in that, the only war we've got? It was a war to kill a commie for Christ, so that capitalists can sell Coca-Cola to the Buddhists. That's what the Vietnam War was about. A war to kill commies for Jesus, so capitalists can sell Coca-Cola to the Buddhists. He didn't want to think about that. And I, for one, wasn't rude enough or stupid enough to try and suggest that he even considered the idea. I just listened to him tell me why Australia and America lost the Vietnam War because the journalists were treasonable traitors and they should have cut down all of the jungle and flattened it with a bulldozer and paved it with bitumen and painted parking lines all over Vietnam and come home by Christmas. And he had every right to think that. He had no right to force anybody else to think that, but that is what he thought. So, yeah, Barklord. Not Barklord, Barklord. That is what I think about war in general. That's the best insight that I've ever stumbled onto as to what the universal creator God theory might think about humans making war on each other. As I say to people in the comments threads quite regularly, America is about to get its face rubbed in the fact that the universal creator God theory is not an old, white, male American who votes Republican. That's not who the universal creator God theory is. So, as a Presbyterian Democrat candidate in Texas said recently, the so-called Christian nationalists in the USA, they worship power and they try to brand the power that they worship as if it had something to do with Christianity. But he said Jesus only had two teachings, and he's a pastor, I'm not. He says that Jesus taught that teaching number one, you have to love the universal creator God theory, and teaching number two, you have to love your neighbour as you love yourself. Absolutely nothing that's being enacted by the United States government run by the Trump administration lines up with any of the teachings of Jesus. It says there in this book of God theory that because somebody agrees to participate in warfare, whether they're a private with a gun in their hand or whether they're king of the country sending the whole army to war, the universal creator God theory is not going to pay any attention at all whatsoever to their prayers. It's all going to be down to a matter of physics. How close are you standing to where the hole's going to go bang? Does the shrapnel go over your head, through your earlobe, or through the middle of your belly button? Physics. Luck. Time. Space. Placement. I suspect the more an individual doubts the worthwhileness of their participation in the war, the more likely they may be to survive. An awful lot of the people that I talk to who went through a war and got out of it more or less okay were the people who didn't know what they were doing when they joined. They did their best as they were taught and they didn't want to let their mates down, but they thought it was all absolute fucking bullshit and they wanted to get out and have nothing to do with any kind of war ever after. It's the true believers who think they're fighting for peace. They're the ones who turn into compost on the battlefield. And here's another thing. While I was a student nurse working for the hospital, the Veterans Affairs Hospital, I saw Elizabeth Kubler-Ross on the television one night, and she was talking to a bloke who'd had a near-death experience on the battlefield in Vietnam. And he'd been helicoptered off the battlefield where he'd been chewed up. He became conscious in a casualty clearing station where he was sort of floating up out of his body, looking down on himself as he was pushed over with a whole bunch of other people who had red tags on them because they weren't worth operating on. And then sometime later, he saw a surgical team give up on the bloke they were operating on and go over to the pile of red tags and grab his body off the gurney and take it to the operating table. And between those two moments, when he'd been put in the pile of hopeless, he'd floated up and out through the roof of the tent, and he'd flown back at helicopter speed, a disembodied spirit. But he had his steel helmet on his head, he had his backpack on his back, he had his boots on, he had his uniform on, he had his rifle, he had his ammunition, he had everything that he'd taken into battle. And he went back to the paddy field where he'd been shot. And he was there, his platoon was there, the helicopter with the lunch that had been brought out hot from base for his mates was there, and there was 2 or 3 Vietnamese ghosts. And he could talk to the ghosts, but they couldn't get the living people to pay attention to him. If he shouted in their ear hole, they'd sort of flip at their ear as if there was a fly or a mosquito there. And he was just getting used to the idea that he could change which hand he was holding his rifle in, and it was getting heavy, but he couldn't put it down and let go of it. Same with his backpack. It was okay as long as he was touching it. He could take it off his shoulders and he could lay down and use it as a pillow, but he was stuck with everything that he took into battle. And then he discovered when he went to walk away, he couldn't get out of the paddy field because he had chosen to go and fight there and he'd died there, and now he was bloody well stuck there. And as I watched Elizabeth Kubler-Ross talking to this bloke about what happened to him, I thought about the thanatourism industry, where people pay a lot of money to go to old battlefields so they can walk around on the beach at Gallipoli and have the ghosts of all of the young Australians who got killed there in 1915 screaming in their ear hole and telling them to fuck off because all war's always all bullshit. Because all of the people who died there, their spirit soul is still stuck there, according to what that fella talking to Kubler-Ross had to say when I saw it on TV in 1983. And it was 1986 before I found that book, where it says in the book, if you take part in war, the penalty is you stay in the first and lowest heaven of the earth, which is the part of the dream time which is in touch with the ground right here, in now, where we are. It's insubstantial. A ghost can walk in and out through a wall. Apparently, according to the God theory, my studies of amateur, self-directed studies of comparative theology have led me to sort of understand. But yeah, I think going to war is a really big, bad, ugly, horrible, stupid, bloody mistake, and I plead guilty. I went and worked for a Veterans Affairs hospital, so I'm in the scoop of people who are stuck here in the first and lowest heaven of earth until warfare ends upon the earth, and that could be a long time. Because the 8.2 billion fucking idiots out there, the selfish fuckwits, they keep electing people who think war's a good idea. They keep paying taxes to buy guns for them. They keep finding reasons to fight against and die struggling with their next door neighbours, in absolute contradistinction to the whole love thy neighbour as you love yourself teaching. About the only good thing I can see about this war is it's going to greatly curtail the amount of industrial fossil fuel burning. And in the light of anthropogenic global warming, there is nothing this planet needs more than an absolute sudden cessation to industrial fossil fuel burning. So it's fucking hilarious that Donald Trump, the patron saint of burning fossil fuel, is having a greater effect at curtailing the world's continuing fossil fuel pollution than pretty much anybody else on earth, because he's just scattering chaos all over the place, and that is stopping the industrial economy from working. The Lord moves in mysterious ways, brother. Not my place to explainificate it, but I try. think I'll call this one Judging This War. Or perhaps Judging These Wars, Judgment Regarding War. It feels appropriate. It encompasses the fact that I am going to, in the video, I quote from the Book of Judgment. I quote the judgment of the universal creator God theory according to that book of war. And I explain how I came to form my own judgment of war and how my judgment of war aligns quite well with that of the universal creator God theory as outlined in that particular book of God theories. Look to your own connection to the universal creator God theory and think about what you think the universal creator God theory might have to say regarding the idea of giving somebody else the power to tell you to go and break the commandment, thou shalt not kill, for political reasons, because it's economically convenient, because it's traditional. To join the army, get your head shot off. Join the army, get your head shot off. Join the army, get your head shot off. Rule Britannia, marmalade and jam. 5 Chinese crackers up your asshole, bang, 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 bang. Kookaburras think it's funny, eh? Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.